Hi listener, this is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ideological doctrine and ego in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. So, what I'm doing in this episode is I'm doing a review of a YouTube video, Anti-Realism niche ideologies. So, this is by a YouTuber called Grej, which is itself a spin-off of another YouTube channel called Grej, but it's spelled different. So, and by someone else, but inspired by it. So, for the larger context here, the channel spelled J-R-E-G, Grej, whatever you call it, like that. What they do, what the guy Greg Guevara does, is he looks at, well, he has a political stance, which is essentially what he calls anti-centrism. Essentially, that now. The thing is, he has this post-irony thing going on where he's got so many levels of irony, he makes it very unclear what he even believes. And that's very much intentional. But at least what he purports is that he's opposed to the status quo because the status quo isn't working or what have you. And the only real meaningful change, in his opinion, can come from the political extremes allying together against the center. But keep in mind that his channel is very satirical and is kind of satirizing the whole political compass and all of that. It's a little bit like, it's got a lot in common with Poland Ball, if you've heard of that. So yeah, that's what he does. And he's just got this series of videos called Centricide, which is about some sort of war inside his head between extremist ideologies and centrist ideologies. It's a bit nonsensical in a way, but it's quite fun. I mean, if you're interested in politics and especially non-conventional ways of looking at it, it's interesting. So anyway, so the video is by a channel which is inspired by it, but it's taking a more philosophical perspective and is more, and the idea of that instead of being anti-centrist, the anti-realist or anti-realist ideologies. And the way they frame realist ideologies or realist politics, I wouldn't necessarily define realism and anti-realism in the same way, but realism and anti-realism in the sense of politics, in the sense that they mean it, is that they define this video in particular is about off-compass politics. It's about views that are political ideologies that are not on the political compass. You want to know what that is? Well, there's the left and right political spectrum. Then there's this idea of political compass test, which a lot of people have started viewing politics in terms of, where there's the authoritarian axis going up and the libertarian axis going down, creating 4 quadrants, right? Of which you could be different parts of, depending on what your political perspective is. And off-compass perspectives are ones which can't be put on it because they're either too extreme on one or one or two particular axes to actually fit onto it, or they just sort of can't neatly be fit on there at all. So they define realism and anti-realism on the Grej YouTube channel as, okay, so they say to them realism politically is starting with, someone starts with the mainstream beliefs and then they start modifying it with more niche changes later. Whereas to them anti-realism is the opposite of that, which I imagine would be, well, starting with going very niche and then maybe getting some features that are mainstream later. So they didn't explicitly say that, but this is what I inferred, because if it's anti it, then it's the opposite, or at least, well, opposed to it. So they're opposed to realism. Now, if you think of it in another sense, philosophically, realism is the idea of essentially that there's an objective reality external to us, and that anti-realism is that there isn't. And honestly, if you look at the law of one, the law of attraction, it's probably more in the anti-realist camp. So when I got into the law of one and this sort of mysticism, I essentially changed camp. Oh, if camp is really the way to look at it, from realist to anti-realist. But these distinctions are ultimately labels and ultimately dualistic, so I wouldn't put too much stock in them. In any case, the so the quote that they get, I'm going to quote what they said, kind of humorously, about like anti-realism in comparison. If I can't have my monarchist uprising, my anarchist revolution, my pacifist direct democracying, and my mutualist mutualizing happen at the exact same time, why even fucking do praxis? So if you want a context, praxis means, essentially, to simplify it, applying or engaging with ideas, which might be political or philosophical or what have you. So the application or engagement with it might simply be verbal, or it might be actually trying to apply it into practical reality. Essentially, it's a very philosophical, maybe even postmodern way of saying, essentially, well, it's not just policy, that wouldn't be, praxis is praxis. And honestly, while it's understandable if one might abhor leftist or postmodern, not that they're the same thing necessarily, but that sort of language, praxis is actually a pretty useful word, I think, despite that. Anyway, I haven't got to the point yet. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a number of different ideologies covered and give my perspective on them. And there's two in particular that are quite intriguing to me because they might have a bit more common ground with the law of one sort of thing and mysticism than the others. Now, obviously, there's other off-campus ideologies. I mean, there's plenty. And they are particularly interesting to me because my journey in politics was I was trying to find for a long time a model of government or policy or running society that would work better than, well, I saw problems in the status quo, but I liked the idea of prosperity and the idea of people trading to get prosperity. I was ever since, I would say, well, I mean, my first introduction to politics was actually, I was pretty non-political until I came across, but I started asking questions and I came across, well, my parents introduced me to their perspective, which was largely Thatcherite. So their perspective was that the trade unions in the UK in the 70s had been causing problems, the public sector unions particularly, and that they felt that they held the country for ransom, and that there was and that they felt that Thatcher saved the country from that by breaking down the unions and standing up to them, which I will admit there is an element of truth there, but I later learned that I had got just one side of it, like one perspective on it, and there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, certainly, like, I would say that in her own way, Thatcher was quite a status quo kind of politician. but a certain kind of status quo. Because sometimes the elites change their mind, or they seem to decide that they want a change, and so the status quo shifts. But you could say neoliberal, or you could say, okay, I'm digressing. Although digressions aren't always bad, but yeah, okay. So the first one mentioned in this is neo-Bolshevism. So if you want to understand neo-Bolshevism, first of all, compare it to Ingsoc. Now, what's Ingsoc? If you read 1984, Ingsoc is the society the main character lives in. So Ingsoc is the government that they live under, right? So that it would be, in that world, that's Britain and the Americas, and like Australia as well, or something. The idea of this different world, that there's mentioned that there's like what, Oceania or something, and then there's, I can't remember the exact details, but these different nations that have different qualities, right? So the neo-Bolshevist one would be like, think like, kind of like the Soviet Union, but with fascist elements as well, which honestly kind of was like that under Stalin anyway. So neo-Bolshevism is like more economically focused than the Ingsoc is. Which Ingsoc, you can think of like English fascism. Well, is it fascism? Is it socialism? English combination of the two, I guess. Neo-Bolshevism is like a Russian style combination of the two, I suppose. Loosely, I'm using labels. Keep in mind, take labels with a pinch of salt, because it's something I need to do as well. And then there's the other one. I can't remember what it's called, but there's essentially, it's like Ingsoc with Chinese characteristics, Asian characteristics. Essentially, it's the idea of, the way it's described in the video is they describe it as a fundamental feature is obliteration of the self. So if you take like the Eastern mysticism, right, the idea of the self or the ego is an illusion, and that reality is nothingness, but also everything, wholeness, and they're the same thing at the same time. Okay, the idea of the identity being an illusion, or that individual identity in particular, take that and twist it into a complete disregard for human life. Think like human wave tactics, and human as a workforce being used as nothing, and that their life being sacrificed is a good thing because their life isn't really worth much, and that their death is actually the glorious thing, probably the best thing in their life. That sort of twisted perspective. Honestly, nothing exemplifies that more, now I don't know, than something in Warhammer 40k, which is the Death Core of Krieg. And you probably haven't heard of it if you haven't heard of Warhammer 40k, but essentially it's like an Imperial Guard regiment, an infantry regiment that is entirely based or from a planet that's, and where they are brainwashed into basically like hating themselves and wanting to die. Well, yeah, essentially what the obliteration of the self is. That, think like, I mean, a sort of kamikaze sort of principle, I suppose. Well, my thoughts on that, well, obviously these three things are pretty awful, which is a judgment and a label, but there you go. I would say that they're probably viewed as quite favorable to those who are or wish to be serve as the self elites who want to dominate society. I suppose it's quite a draconian way of looking at things, and pun intended. Yeah. Pretty awful. But what's interesting about the obliteration of self one is that it is actually taking something that in a way is kind of a good thing, or a mysticism in a sense, taking that sort of, those sort of ideas and then using it for something evil. Although that's interesting that that is what some of the worst, most oppressive systems can do. It's like it can be like a fish hook, right? You get something good and people are like, oh yeah, well that's interesting. And then like bait and switch. So yeah, anyway, so what's next? What's next? Well, the next one mentioned is esoteric fascism and esoteric socialism, which tend to have pagan or mystic elements. Or just, yeah, or wait, what's occult influences, I suppose. They didn't actually say that in the video, but it's pretty strongly implied. I mean, esoteric implies that, right? Something came out about the word esoteric, because esoteric would be actually exclusive set ideas that are kept away from the larger public and into select groups of people in maybe secret societies or whatever. And maybe they didn't use the right terminology or the most accurate terminology in the video, because what they're talking about is fascism or socialism with pagan or mystic characteristics, which to them, they would say makes it wacky and thus way off compass, which perhaps it does. I'm not sure about that entirely, because just because there's religion involved, that mean, like, does theocracy or theocratic elements or religious elements make anything off compass? Not necessarily. I mean, for a long time, if anything, what's abnormal historically is secularism. So if we're looking at this, as this an interesting way to think about the political compass generally, right? Because we think about like, so we think about politics typically as, you know, the left and right. I might think like socialism versus capitalism, or you might think fascism versus socialism, or you might think conservatism versus leftism or whatever. Or you might think conservatives versus liberalism. There's different comparisons, and you can think of the political compass, and you could think of, well, the authoritarianism is up, libertarianism, more freedom focus is down, and well, left, right, as you know, and different ideologies at different points in that. But if you think about it, well, where's feudalism on that? It's off compass, arguably, right? But it was normal for such a long time, and yet we're saying it's off compass. Maybe we're off compass. What even is on compass, right? Maybe it's a relative thing to where we're at based on where the status quo happens to be. So if you think about many of the empires, like the Roman Empire, I mean, that's slavery. And if you think like, you could say they're all just in the top right quadrant, or the top right at the top with authoritarianism. But like, I'm not sure about that. Like, maybe the whole, I mean, you could make the whole compass bigger to represent more area, and then things that would be off compass aren't. But even then, that kind of, there's more to it than that. I mean, Grej, the YouTuber, made I'll try to pronounce it right. So he made a satirical, but also surprisingly insightful at the same time, video about like 100+ political compass test or something, right? But to be fair, if you think about it as a whole set of lots of spectrums, rather than being something you have to visually represent with a two-dimensional diagram, that actually kind of makes more sense. Because it's a lot more complex than these models we have. They're simplifications. And if anything, what the left-right dichotomy does, or especially the political compass as well, it actually obfuscates more than it clarifies, because it oversimplifies, right? although simplification is a good thing. I'm not quite sure. It's a little more complex than that as well, because in one of my interviews we discussed the one from darkness through darkness and from darkness into light, that one with Mark Thieler. In that one of the principles we discussed is that, in a sense, left and right represent chaos and order. Although perhaps we could do away with left and right and just focus on chaos and order in society and politics. And maybe that would even clarify even further, because then we could not even bother with the whole mess that left and right, based on something in the French Parliament, like where people sat, like we can move away from that whole morass, right? I know I'm digressing, but I like the digression, so hopefully you will too. So what the chaos and order principle, my take on it at the moment is that there are different paths to unity, essentially. Well, for a long time, maybe unity wasn't truly possible on a societal level due to the frequency of where a lot of people were at. So the best that could have been attained was a kind of balance. And that can change now at the end of this year and coming into the age of Aquarius. But in any case, the chaos approach, which some people are more psychologically prone to, or at least develop more psychologically prone to, one way or the other or both, is that, okay, let's go out and explore, boldly go out and expand horizons, literally, physically. That, like, think of like conquistadors going out, sailing out to explore new unknown waters and all that, or like just going out, adventuring, broadening horizons mentally or whatever, like, or inventing new stuff, philosophizing, the exploratory part of us, high openness people, to put it in terms of the big five personalities system. And to be fair, this is actually a valuable thing, right? And what you could say, those on the left and people who are liberal, which I won't say are the same thing, and these are arbitrary anyway, they're more libertarians too to some extent, although I'm not sure about exactly how that fits in. And they're more in the chaotic side, in that they're going out from the status quo and the comfort, stable security, and they're like, let's go out into this more uncertain, dark chaos and kind of grapple and deal with, maybe forge new order out of it, or maybe just learn new things, explore, maybe free from the restraints of order, of the order that they grew up in, right? In the status quo. Now, order, obviously, what it is, it probably links more psychologically with conscientiousness, I would say. And order and more conservative people also higher in disgust levels, which tend to correlate with higher levels of conscientiousness. And if you disagree, well, you're free to disagree. I'm not going to bother backing this up empirically. This is my impression I've got anyway. So the more conservative, okay, the more order-oriented people in society, what they tend to do is, well, they are the foundation of society, like the actual economic foundation, the social foundation, maintaining the social norms, the economic foundation and activity of which this going forth into society, going forth beyond the boundaries of society in different respects, is from the, like a springboard from that order. Like you need the order to even be able to get that exploration sustainably. And you need the change that comes from this going forth into the unknown and changing things up. And it's the yin yang kind of thing, right? You can't have things be static or ossified and then like collapses. You can't have things be too fluid or you might lose coherence of society as well. Or at least that's how it's been for a long time. And for a long time, balance and just following the way, I suppose, has been, a balance has been generally the most sustainable society. And that, but what's been happening as we're getting closer to the awakening and coming into the awakening is that, well, to individualize, to integrate your shadow, to confront your shadow and the negative in your subconscious and let go of it and move into another level of consciousness, it requires confronting the darkness. That means more of that darkness, the chaos, the negativity, the uncertainty, more of that comes up, so that more, the left have gone further. Those who are more, let's say, inclined towards chaos have gone further into that, more extensively. More of them have gone that way, right? So less people have stayed in the middle towards balance, and more people have either gone further into the chaos, the unknown, also because they've become more aware of what's wrong with the existing order. And so they're like, no, let's go more the other way, because fuck that, right? So that the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, one aspect of that has brought about is the increased awareness, more higher consciousness to some extent, which meant higher awareness and consciousness of how dark things were. And what do people do when they come across that? Well, they stick to it anyway and refuse to accept that it's dark, or they're like, no, we need to fundamentally change it. But to do that actually requires going into the unknown, which symbolically is more the darkness and chaos, which ironically they're going into to overcome it. But, and in a sense, mirror effect means that individually and collectively, the external reflects the internal, vice versa. So, essentially, that's why the darkness is coming up, right? Because now it's possible to awaken, and also the more people on each side, the more people are sticking to the old ways, that they get threatened, so they get more extreme, and that's a sort of reactionary push. You get more people going more in the status quo, or more just simply in opposition to the left or liberals, which I'm not saying are the same. And this sort of dynamic, I mean, World War II, World War I, this sort of, World War II in particular, this clash of ideologies seem to be one feature of that. And as we get this clash of ideologies now, the culture war, especially the culture war online, that millennials and Gen Zs, more so millennials, I wouldn't just say put it out to one generation in particular, but this culture war starting around, I wouldn't say it started around 2014, it started around maybe around 2010, but the real date would be 2012, which isn't a coincidence, by the way. 2012 to 2020, this period in particular, it's in terms of astrology, there's a significance to that. And if you were listening to my episodes already, I'll intro this to sort of content, you may well have an idea of that already. I won't go too much into it, but yeah, it's to do with, like, you know, moving to the age of Aquarius. Right, so this whole tendency towards balance, that's actually, things are getting more unbalanced because we're going to a new higher frequency, a more conscious balance. No, it's not really a balance, it's moving beyond duality. Anyway, it's a fun digression, but that's enough for now. The next one that was mentioned was cult Darwinism and cult communalism. Now, two concepts that, two ideologies that they've come up with, the Grej, I think, was it? Which way round is it? Like, Okay, the actual video I'm talking about, not the one that's inspired by. The anti-realist ones. What they're doing, okay, this is they've got this idea of social Darwinism. Is one of what they do is something I mentioned about both of those YouTube channels is what they do is they create characters out of different ideologies and have them interact in these story arcs. So yeah, I didn't mention that part of it. But so there's a Darwinist character, social Darwinist character, who was like saying that he believed that the best society was if we let the weak die, right? And that the communalist, I guess, has a different stance. It's like let's all work together and ban private property, and if you don't like it, tough shit. That attitude. Now, cult Darwinism or cult communalism is that, but theologically. So they was like being to be Darwinist because, as they said, because Aries said so, right? That's what they said. That's how they described it in the video. And as for, I think like Sparta or something, or like Corn and 40K, Warhammer 40K, cult communalism. I mean, think like cults where everyone's dehumanized and has no property, or even, well, some communes that have been tried. But I imagine the advocates of, but there were some anarchists who were quite sentimental about communes that have been tried, and I'm not going to disparage how they feel about it because then there might be significance in that. So the next one, which is quite an amusing one, it's quite popular among the libertarian left, is fully automated luxury gay space communism. Yeah, so that's actually a thing. So full automated, what that means is that they have a use of AI and machines and all that, so that human beings don't need to do any work themselves, and they could just do art and whatever they want, including probably lots of gay sex, presumably. Which, fair enough, if that's what you want to do, although it is a bit hedonistic, and that's probably not like harmonious, really, is it? And going into space. And the best example in sci-fi to actually fit this would be, oh shit, what are they called? I can't remember what they're called, but I know it was interesting. The Commonwealth, I think they're called. I think they're just called the Commonwealth. Some Hamilton, I think they're called. No, that's not what they're called. Wait, give me a sec. Maybe I'm getting mixed up between something else. Yeah. No, I'm not thinking the Commonwealth Saga by Peter Hamilton is a good series, but it's not the one I'm thinking of. It's actually completely unrelated. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't remember what it's called. It would be good for it to reference it, but it's one where these AIs that work with people. Whatever. I might remember it later. I might not. I'm not going to spend ages trying to look for it. But anyway, so the idea is that behind that would be, well, it's all entirely collectivist, no private property. Personal property would exist because they distinguish between personal property and private property. They're saying no land ownership, that would be collectivized. The means of production would be publicly owned but run by machines. That is how it would work. And everyone would have all the luxuries they want, and they would just do art and stuff. If you think of the Venus Project, well, it's not in space, but it's not nothing inherently gay about it. But it's that's a sort of vibe that you might that might help clarify a bit. So the whole gay part might be humorous, but I mean, this is libertarian socialists we're talking about, right? Not to generalize too much, but very big on the whole LGBT free love, but interpreting love in a more casual sex kind of way. Kind of, all right, I'm not going to judge it, but obviously I would say it's quite red-ray in terms of chakras, maybe orange. Like basically, so, but if it were green ray, which means open heart society, if it were service to others and entirely voluntary, like something like that wouldn't inherently be a bad thing at all. Although that's not generally how it's characterized. Though generally the people who advocate it are materialists and not spiritualists or mystics. So that materialism might be a problem with it, in my opinion. So the next one is meant to be the opposite: fully manual poverty, straight earth capitalism. That's what they call it. Now, honestly, what I think of is dwarves from Lord of the Rings, but without kings, because they're like really about having gold and trading. Like, honestly, if you think about cryptocurrency, is like one way of, in a very loose sense, because there's miners, and then they're like, no. That's a really big stretch, that one. The way it's portrayed seemed to be, so it's like what, free market capitalism, but only for white people or something, living underground in bunkers. It's, I don't know. It seems particularly incoherent, even for the ideologies in the list in the video. So now the next one mentioned was Habsburgism. So if you know the Habsburg dynasty, what they were a dynasty who were very prone to arranged marriages that were incestuous, most commonly with cousins, but they did it even closer to that at times. So they had inbreeding symptoms, obviously. And in a sense, you could say it's a bit like an ethno-state, but where the rulers are all, the society is all entirely, well, the same family, literally. And I suppose the peasantry, or those who are not of the ruling elite, are considered almost like not second-class citizens. Like they're not of that society. They're just forced to serve that society, in a sense. It's pretty authoritarian in a way. I mean, it was like feudalism in a way. It's pretty authoritarian. So it's like it's like a bit like feudalism, a bit like ethno-nationalism, but the ethnicity being the family, not the ethnicity. So yeah. All right, so I'll tell you what. The next two are, there's two prominent ones that are interesting to me here, but I'm not going to go into them yet. What I'm going to do is go into the other ones, and then I'm going to go to the two ones that interest me because I've got more to say about them. So Kaftaocracy. If you've read Kafta, or if you've heard about Kafta, the author, based on his work, there's this idea of Kafta trap, which is that it's a sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation, where you're set up a situation in a discussion with someone where either way you respond, they've got a response that they've got a response that basically confirms the conclusion they started with. So it's like you're setting someone up to fail in your interaction with it. It's non sequiturs used in a dishonest way, essentially, or used in a, because the thing is, capital traps, some people are unconscious when they engage in politics, and when they come across ideas they don't understand, they subconsciously engage in capital traps. Though I'm going on a bit of a tangent because that wasn't even right in my notes. So what it mentions here is that, so he portrays, Frank Kafka described societies in his novel, he described it, portrays a society in his novel of faceless bureaucracy, and in which people are powerless in the face of, right? So such a society like this would be like, well, imagine a bureaucracy rules, and the bureaucracy is so total in its control that everyone are powerless before it, right? And that's an interesting take, right? That's an interesting idea of society. Now, keep in mind, these are all considerably wacky ideologies are off compass, but what does that even mean? Okay? Illuminatism. So, okay, this is a rule by the Illuminati. If you've listened to my other videos, you might realize that from my perspective, the last few thousand years on Earth have pretty much been this. And all the other political systems have been subordinate systems which mask the true nature of the rule. So, okay, I would call it the cabal, and I say there's 13 families that for a long time have ruled. Now, which family is in one of the 13 families might switch around a bit, but generally speaking, the 13th one rules the others. And the idea is that they, a charitable interpretation is that for a long time they were maintaining balance, and that people who incarnated, souls that incarnated on Earth that will serve as self, tended to vie for power and control, and tended to be in the ruling elite as a result of that, and that the 13th family kept them in control. That's a charitable take on it, giving them the benefit of the doubt, essentially. And that now is a time where it's not necessary and their world is falling apart, but there's a potential risk of those who are power hungry rising up, because chaos is a ladder. If you remember that from Littlefinger said it in Game of Thrones. But that's a charitable interpretation. The uncharitable one, which honestly, I'm not exactly sure, but I suspect it's the uncharitable one, really, is that, okay, there are these 13 families that are manipulating things. They may well, I don't think they are literally reptilians, as David Icke says. They might be, but I suspect it's more like Anunnaki bloodlines, which are somewhat diluted but still there, or maybe pseudo reptilian bloodlines, and they tend to be service to self, which, if you're not sure what that is, essentially that there's two ways. Okay, there's different types of soul affiliations, basically, or alignments. Self-serving or service to others. Service to others is, okay, the original would be simply following the law of one and alignment to the overall unity of everything, which is technically unpolarized. It's not like serving others. It's not serving yourself. It's simply, it's like a balance, right? Then the idea, because there is duality in the universe, there are many souls that are either trying to help other people and seeking out the divine in their interaction with others and their creation, their co-creation with others, right? And part of this would involve manifestation using the law of attraction and mentalism and such. And service to others being those who cut their ties, essentially, with the overall infinite source of creation. This is like pantheism sort of thing. And what they do is, it's almost like a rebellion against reality, in a sense, so that there's a fundamental dishonesty and self-dishonesty involved, and a fundamental it's based on fear and hatred, primarily on fear, actually. But from that, think about like a twisted flower, like from that it sprouts out, from that fear sprouts out hatred, anger, guilt, and negative emotions, right? Whereas, and the lower three chakras, so which represent different things. So it's more survival based, more ego based. Also, pride is a very big thing too. And honestly, a lot of misery for themselves and for others. A lot of suffering. But the way service to self entities view it tends to be that they're strong and they're the strong ones, and as opposed to weak and blah 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 blah. But given their tendency to deceive, it's not really about strength, is it? Like, so it's like, look, the idea of looking out for numero uno sort of thing, as if numero uno isn't infinite source, but oneself. But I mean, yeah, anyway, so if the rulers are like that, so the idea would be that, yeah, for a long time, the rulers, it's like shadow government, like the power behind the throne. So think of it like, see, if there's a secret society and there's a king, but the secret society is the real power and the head of the secret society really dominates. Or you could think, or that maybe the secret society starts infiltrating the banks when commerce, as you move into the capitalist age. And it's not a coincidence that the Rothschilds are one of the families of the cabal. And I highly suspect they are the only Jewish family in the cabal, which, by the way, if you're wondering if, yeah, the anti-Semitic perspective is absolute nonsense, in my opinion. So, although unity, you need to account for everything, even things that are unsavory, as part of the overall unity. So, I mean, the fact that the Rothschilds are Jewish, I mean, like, it's not because of that. It's incidental, but that is something, at least, you can, I suppose, if you were to be charitable to anti-Semites, which I know it's unpalatable to even do that, but if we were going to be unconditional empathetic, then it's something to do, then it's at least understandable that some who have not done a lot of shadow work at all, who are very unconscious, one thing they might see is more Jews in higher places, and then, or they might look at the role that Israel has as a puppet state of the US and make an association, and they might look at the role of Jews in money lending historically, and they'll just make the association, they're behind it, they're the problem, which isn't actually how it is at all. And those, yeah, it's actually clear as day to those who aren't blinded by bigotry. But yeah, anyway, I didn't need to go into that, but anyway. So the other aspect of it is, okay, the role of service as self-reptilians and negative energy beings in influencing and manipulating the cabal themselves. And the cabal themselves don't realize that they themselves are being tricked by archons and worse. So, okay, that's pretty low vibe. So moving on. I actually went more into that than I intended, but yeah. And I honestly, I went into a lot more into it than they did in the video. The next one was senatorialism, which is portrayed as the opposite as Illuminatianism, but not really much else is said. My impression is that that would be, think like a true republic where no conspiracies exist at all. It's true Republican democratic elections. It's like, imagine like how people imagine the American Republic. The dream, the impossible dream. Well, senatorialism is that impossible dream actually occurring? And okay, it's not impossible, but it requires all of society to be fourth density positive, or at least or fourth density negative, or fourth density neutral, perhaps. For it to actually sustainably work in the way it's intended. Technically speaking, you can have it. Otherwise, there'd be things like secret societies, conspiracies, and backward DMs and all that stuff. And when there's negative polarity people involved, there's always going to be conspiracies and stuff. And so, honestly, this inspires me to mention another thing I've been thinking, which is all political systems, any that could be put in place, if the participants of that society are, well, third density or in 3D, or basically haven't as a whole got open heart chakras, if they're not empathizing with each other universally and with unconditional compassion, then what happens is people divide up into groups and don't empathize with each other properly, and you get some people who serve as a self, and you get these conspiracies and all this, all this negativity. So basically, no, if you're looking for the perfect political system, pre the age of Aquarius, in the age of Pisces, in the age of Aries, it is literally impossible to have the perfect system. Impossible, because the human beings that make it up make sure that that's not going to happen. No matter, take the perfect system, they would ruin it. We would have ruined it. It requires the awakening to change that, and which is what's going on now. Momentism, now this is probably the most absurd of all of them, although we'll see what we think about the one after it. Freezing time with this status quo is like freezing the time forever. So, I mean, just two ways of looking at this. You could look at it as symbolically freezing time and just say, okay, whatever the status quo is now, just make it stay that way forever. A more radical way of looking at this, which I suppose is probably the way it is intended, the idea is literally freeze time permanently. Now, for there to be an end of time, looking at it from the law of one or mystical perspective, everything would have to be in total and utter entropy. Everything would have to be completely and utterly unified with no separation whatsoever, no distinctions. It would all be just complete uniformity in one. It would require everything go back to source. That's not how the idea was intended, but that's what it would require. Oh, and no more time, but that's what, yeah. All right, so chaosism. I mean, if you know Warhammer, you might have a clue about this. So pure chaos, worship of chaos. Quote, politics as an unyielding political war. So I've applied to politics. This is different ideologies in permanent ideological conflict with each other. No peace and only discordant discourse. And in a song they had at the end of the video, they compared it to Tzeentch, which is in Warhammer 40k lore, the chaos god of deceit and, ironically, of knowledge as well. So Yeah. All right. Now for the two stars of the show. Gosh, I like the sound of my own voice, don't I? I'm going on this long. All right. All right. So if you're still here, thanks. So one of the ones that I found particularly interesting in the video. Well, the first one that was interesting, xenophilic universalism. So, well, there's two main ways to look at this, although they're not entirely incompatible. One is, okay, well, that looks awfully like the law of one if you think about it, or at least the confederation of planets. So what is the confederation of planets is like a confederation of planetary civilizations and conscious planets, because that's the thing in the law of one, that are either service to others or service to others and service to unity is my own phrase. That's not the way I put it. Unpolarized. They were at conflict at one point. They were at war with the Orion Confederation, but I don't think the Orion Wars are still happening. I might be wrong. That's probably ancient history anyway. I don't know what's going on with that per se. But okay, so if you would want to have context of this, I'll say, so xenophilic, what does that mean? Xeno with X-E-N-O, philic. Well, first of all, friendly with aliens, right? It's the opposite of phobia. It's not fear. It's friendliness. Now, there's another way of looking at philic, but I won't go into that yet. Universalism. So essentially, we are all one. Unity, consciousness, the idea of working together as and the law of one and that sort of thing. Ultimately, us being in the confederation of planets after the awakening would probably be like, well, xenophilic universalism, or at least one interpretation of it. So that would be, so according to Ra, in the Ra material, there's 53 civilizations in the confederation of planets and 500 planetary consciousnesses, planetary consciousness complexes. Now, I don't know exactly, I imagine that might be living planets, but I'm not sure. But this is interesting because that means more planetary consciousness complexes than actual civilizations. I imagine that means some of the civilizations have a whole bunch of planets under them, and or that some of them don't have planets. Some of the members civilizations don't have planets, and or some of them, there are multiple civilization member states or whatever, member civs on the same planet in cases, right? Or something else I don't know. Anyway, so, and this includes multiple galaxies. So apparently they define galaxies differently. So yeah. And on different levels of, different dimensional levels or matrices. So we only see a certain bandwidth of reality, even with our technology. So there's certain, here's an interesting thing when it comes to, I can't remember what it's called. There's a certain equation about how likely it is we are to find space, aliens in space, right? Which incidentally was written after the point where aliens were discovered, even though it says the chance of us finding aliens is unlikely. So it's just a reflection of the fact that disclosure hasn't really happened, or at least softer disclosure has started to happen. If you've seen that online, that 2001 Space Odyssey, there was this monolith. If you've seen a monolith that appeared in the Utah desert, and then they found one, I think they saw one in the Antarctica, I'm not sure about that. Something happened, was found there. But then they found it in Romania. It looks pretty much the same. So that's quite interesting. It's like maybe it teleported or something, or maybe it's a fake and it's a soft way to do disclosure. Maybe it's a great fear. I don't know what that is, but it's interesting anyway. So what else can I say about the configuration of planets for context here? Oriented towards emotions such as love, joy, unconditional love, that is, not romantic, though not exclusive, it can be romantic of those. Love, joy, peace, and enlightenment. So, yeah. All life, part of, so one of the principles they hold to is the idea that all life is part of the one original thought. I think that's logos, is that concept. And they're allied in service to the law of one, apparently. And I imagine that means they're not in favor of separation, that they're opposed to separation, although I don't know. I don't know that for sure. So my impression is that, we are not formally in the Confederation until we are ready for the quarantine to be lifted. So the quarantine is apparently, according to Ra, maintained by the Council of Saturn, which is representatives of the Confederation. And they apparently there's 9 of them, it's otherwise known as Council of 9. And then there's also, backing them up, there's the Council of 24 Guardians, who, yeah. So, yeah, what else can I mention about this? So apparently there are many confederations, and also there are planets in our solar system that are members of the Confederation, even though we're not, or at least perhaps we could have something like association status before we're in it formally, but yeah. Okay, so in that context of the other interpretation of xenophilic, which I would say isn't so much a mature interpretation, but that's a judgment, is okay. One way to put it is, if anyone was a fan of 140K, there's this idea of and anyone a way of shipping, there's this idea of the Primarch Gulliman and Yvraine, who's an Eldar, who's like a space elf, checking up. It's not official in the law, but it's like a, people joke about it. I suppose, like, imagine if someone was just like, people have this idea, right? Whether like they want to go around the world, like having sex with people in different parts of the world, and then like mark it off a list. It's really a red ray sort of thing. It's like, okay, they're not focused on meaningful connection with people. They're just essentially masturbating with other people. That's what they're doing. Now, they're probably unhappy for doing that. Who are we to say that it's wrong, but it's probably more inclined towards being unpolarized or service to self. So not ideal, that sort of thing. But I mean, it's not to be like that they're bad people for doing that. That would be judgment, right? Or condemnation. But yeah, I mean, that's one way of interpreting that, as like that idea of someone being like that, but with aliens. Or if you want to see the anime, Interspecies Reviewer, which is in this fantasy world where the main characters go to brothels. I'm actually recording this. I guess I am, hey? Okay, so they go to brothels in different parts of their fantasy world, and they, review their experiences. And yeah, I suppose some people of a certain mindset might see it that way. But if they actually went and undergo an awakening, they would cease to be interested in that. So I don't really foresee that happening. That said, I've actually heard, interesting enough, that there are in the Confederation open heart, green ray or above couples of different species. I don't know if that's true or not, whether it's so technically, that's the greatest extent I think that it applies. So anyway, what's the other one? Moving on from that meta-anarchism. All right, the way it's described is quite interesting. So first of all, I'll describe anarchism so you have context. Anarchism is considered opposition to all, quote, archons. Now, not archons in the sense of aliens, although I can understand that. I can get behind that. Although opposition itself is something to be careful with. But yeah, it's more opposition to all authority and hierarchy. So meta-anarchism is essentially post-structuralist anarchism. Now you could say it's a bit like a form of postmodernism, where they're opposed to all structure conceptually, linguistically, and all hierarchy conceptually. They actually tend to be against duality conceptually and in society. So they have this idea. Now, people like that would include Derrida and Foucault and those sorts, I think. Yes, so post-structuralism actually originated in France in like the 60s and 70s and 80s, I think. Whereas those, okay, so there's this, whereas postmodernism could be thought of as originating from Frankfurt in Germany. That's the Frankfurt School that is referred to by typically conservatives or are ideologically opposed to it in a somewhat dogmatic way, but an understandable way. Although what I'm focused on here isn't taking sides. I won't deny I've got bias, right? But part of my journey is moving away from that. This isn't me being a wise sage who's got no ideology, just completely guarding everyone else from ideology. No. This is me moving from ideology to unity on a journey, and people come with me, sort of thing. That's the whole idea. So, yeah. Meta-anarchism. So there's no the idea of this is that there's no inherent structure to reality, but it's not nihilism. It's not nihilistic, actually. It opposes imposing systems, mentally or literally, whether it opposes, for example, an anarchist revolution, unless it be pacifist, because that wouldn't be, that overthrow itself would be an imposition, which would be an oppressive hierarchy. That's the way they see it. And they're opposed to the advocacy of that because conceptually and linguistically, they're opposed to hierarchy, and they're opposed to prioritizing any idea above any others. Is like, to them, it's structural fascism. They're against structure itself. They think structure itself is the thing that oppresses the human spirit. Now, actually, there's actually something, I actually like something about that. Although it's funny because I used to be so vehemently against post-structuralism. Really, I was just like, it's the worst thing, it's a destroying society, blah, 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 blah. But I was dogmatic. So, what else? So all different parts of reality voluntarily interacting. They don't like language which is to them forceful language. So if language is put in a way that's like, I don't mean the communication, but it's put in a way like forces someone else to the idea that they're wrong. If you're telling someone they're wrong, that's forcing your ideas at them. And it's just like, yeah. So that's why they'll say that, oh, words can be force and violence, and that Anyway, something interesting about this is that it's very relativist and very subjectivist, and that there's no objective reality, everything's in flux, and there's no structured systems, clear systems. And that, okay, so there's this part, the section where they describe this, where they talk about the meta-anarchy guide to post-structuralism. We are, quote, we are all designing machines as everything is, yeah, so the idea is that we're all designing machines as everything is without clear boundaries, processes, not objects, keeping everything in motion. It reproduces in a loose sense, some in complementary ways, some in others as contradictors, or both. So I thought of when I read that. Complementary, serves to others. Contradicting, serves to self. Or both, unpolarized. Even bacteria in your gut affect your behavior. One, as below, so above, so above, so below. Two, you interact with your gut, bacteria in a sense, and that if they were to all just sort of refuse to cooperate with work with your body and actually overthrow you, not overthrow your body, what does that even mean? If they were to all just multiply to a point that it just kills you, like, to them that would be an unharmonic, they don't use the word harmony, but if you think about it, what they're talking about is they believe in the idea of different systems of every level of reality, although they don't really believe in levels of reality, but whatever, all being complementary. That's why they would prefer it, which seems to be a sort of harmony kind of working together as beings in reality thing, which might sound familiar to my kind of mysticism, or mysticism in general. And generally postmodernism, post-structuralism are actually quite mystical or quite compatible with mysticism, which might actually be a path by which postmodernists and post-structuralists may well come to unity. So do their post-language, the structure and language as well. So now something to keep in mind here is if you look at quantum physics, if you look at my episode, the scientific version of the law of one, or if you read Living in that section of the book of Living the Law of One, 101 The Choice, or any such channel material that discusses that in the Law of One raw material itself. And if you look into Gaia TV, has episodes where they talk about the overlap between quantum physics and mysticism and how they strongly overlap. If you look into that, now I've described this before, but I will go into it again. If you look into how, first of all, when you observe quantum, when you observe things in quantum, essentially you interfere with the result, and you can only observe its position or its momentum, but you can't observe both. It's almost like your decision to observe one of them or the other determines which you to see. And there's various other ways in quantum physics where it definitely interferes with the result. Schrodinger's cat is a representation of that. If you look at, if you were to open the box to see if it's alive or dead, if it were alive, opening it would kill it, thus you would see a dead cat. If it were dead, well, you'd open it and see a dead cat. Thus there's no way to know, and finding out would interfere with the result. The idea is, in what that represents is the idea of, in quantum physics, of all the possibilities, of which there are many, potentially infinite, collapse into one outcome randomly when you observe. And when you're not observing, it's all of them at the same time, or all the potentials. That's all the superposition or superposition. And apparently that's the way reality works. Now, there's three main theories about how that works, but I will go into them right now. The main one, the Copenhagen interpretation, is how I described it. Though interestingly, increasingly, there's a concept that's been embraced of non-locality, which is, quote, spooky action at distance, because that's how Einstein described it disparagingly, which is that things that aren't adjacent interact as if they are, which to me, now string theory and M theory, what they go into is this idea of multiple dimensions and different chords or different tones of strings, which are smaller than quarks, like strings of energy essentially, with different sounds in a sense, like affecting particles in different ways. So yeah, I'll be back. All right, sorry about that. Right, so, and what that would suggest is that, with quantum, is the energy and vibration effect, particles and interactions, and the only difference is in quantum the law of one and the confederations perspective, that's what it says in the book, in that part of the book, is, which is a scientific way of looking at the law of one, because there's different perspectives which are valid, which are still technically the law of one. And according to that, it's not random, but rather determined by consciousness and the emotional vibration of that consciousness in question. This links to the idea of how we affect reality with the law of attraction and mentalism. Now, how does that link in to meta-anarchy and post-structuralism? Well, so the way they describe every part of reality as desiring machines, life as desiring machines, and we are all, as in all of reality, that's how I'm interpreting it, without clear boundaries, processes, not objects, keep bumping around and everything in motion, it all reproduces, and this is in every aspect of reality. So in my perspective, I think this is actually quite consistent with the law of one, this kind of perspective, and post-structuralism and postmodernism are, I think. And meta-anarchy is actually, in a way, it's definitely one way of viewing the ecological consequence of their stance. And if that fits into the law of one, it also fits into xenophilic universalism as well, which makes those two ideas actually, even though they're meant to be very niche ideologies and kind of amusing concepts, actually, there's a lot of interesting things to discuss about them. That's what I found anyway. Well, unless, of course, you're not interested in what I talk about, in which case, why are you still here? Yeah. All right. So that is all of this content. Now, I presume you enjoyed it if you're still here. So this is an introduction, a bit long for an introduction, but there you go, of off-campus political perspectives. I'm not going to shy away from politics, but I do want to keep in mind as a principle to guide myself in that I've been dogmatic before in the past, before I did this podcast. I don't want to be overly dogmatic. I don't want to be dogmatic. I want to be open-minded and all that. And it's the whole, from ideology to unity, not ideology, right? So, well, I hope you enjoyed it. I did. So, yeah. Bye for now.